keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show.
You're listening to The Tom Daniel Show, and I'm your host, Tom Daniel. A little boy told his mother that he wanted to be a banjo player when he grew up. His mother replied, "You can't do both." Okay, let's unpack this a bit. There's this common idea floating around that country music and bluegrass are basically the same thing. You know, acoustic instruments, similar themes, similar personal appearance and southern accents of the performers, similar geography. It's just a bunch of hicks and pickup trucks on the Grand Ole Opry, so what's the difference? It's definitely a super common misconception, though. Like they're interchangeable, and both just different shades of this big umbrella of Southern music. But it goes way deeper than just who's wearing the cowboy hat. Country and bluegrass are much more different than they are alike, and there are some surprising fundamental differences when you dig in. Bluegrass might actually have more in common with jazz than country. Therefore, my mission today is to help you be more properly well-informed on this topic, because you never know when you're going to need it. I mean, you don't know when this is ever going to come up in your life, but you'll be ready. I want you to not only be able to distinguish between these two styles when you hear them, but also understand why they're different. So let's start with the common ground between the two. Country and bluegrass both tap into the same source material. That's deep roots with those old Scots-Irish folk tunes found throughout Appalachia. And that shared ancestry is key. That's in the DNA for both styles. Now, many Americans would be quick to point out that country and bluegrass are just both examples of white folks' music, but that's missing the entire picture. Now, I'm not going to fall back on the usual pointless gesture and say, Charlie Pride was black and Rhiannon Giddens is black and they played country and bluegrass. That's just useless tokenism. A much more solid approach would be to recognize the huge African-American influence on both country and bluegrass music. The instrumentation in bluegrass is solidly African-American instead of European, because the banjo is an African instrument brought to America by slaves. And the blues-style song structure in country is clearly African-American. The proper way to refer to music of this nature is Southern. Not black, not white, but Southern, because it's really impossible to deconstruct country and bluegrass back into recognizably separate components. Now, we intellectually know where the components came from, but they take on a unique identity when blended together in Southern music. Those intertwined cultural threads are much more than just the sum of their parts. In what may be the most profound thing I'm going to say all day today, the blend is the identity. Now, let's move on to what makes them sound different and feel different. Now, obviously, the best way to explain it would be to listen and compare. So let's start with a couple of examples of each. Now, I've asked Mary Mac, the world's most perfect band, to create some generic country music and generic bluegrass music without any vocals. So let's see what they came up with. Now, as you listen to each example, focus on the instruments that you hear. That's all to start with, just the instruments. Which instruments do you hear, and are they the same or different? Okay, Rip, give us about 1 minute of country music. Okay, now let's hear about 1 minute of Bluegrass. Okay, so what did you hear? First, the instruments are definitely very different. Although both acts use bass and guitar, the Bluegrass song actually features banjo, fiddle, and mandolin, and it's easy to think of that as being the typical Bluegrass sound. You didn't hear either of those instruments in the country song, although not every Bluegrass song will feature a banjo, fiddle, and mandolin. Most of them do, in addition to a dobro, which is kind of a slide guitar. That particular combination of instruments immediately makes people think of Bluegrass. I mean, nobody hears a banjo, fiddle, and mandolin and thinks, Beethoven! Those instruments are almost exclusive to Bluegrass, and only a rare few country songs ever use them. By the way, an interesting fun fact is that Bluegrass music uses stringed instruments exclusively. You're going to find a flute, a piano, or a drum in Bluegrass. It's all strings all the time. And while we're at it, what is the official difference between a fiddle and a violin anyway? Now, basically, a fiddle is a violin with attitude. It's the exact same instrument, but the difference is in how it's played. There can be some physical differences if fiddle players prefer a flatter bridge under the strings to make it easier to play double stops and quick string crossings. And fiddle players also prefer steel strings to give it a little bit of a brighter sound, kind of a bite. But the official difference between a fiddle and a violin is all in the way it's played. Now, the country song featured a pedal steel guitar, which you do not hear in Bluegrass. You hear dobro instead in Bluegrass. Now, most significantly, the country music used an electric guitar, an electric bass, and drums. You never hear drums or anything electric in Bluegrass, while those things are standard in country music. And by the way, the pedal steel is electric, so that's why you don't hear it in Bluegrass. Occasionally, you'll hear a country song with a fiddle or a banjo, but they're more like guest instruments than standard instruments. Therefore, one of the most prominent differences between country and Bluegrass in general is the overall instrumentation. They sound different because they use different instruments. Now, at this point, if you want to go away all on your own and listen to some familiar examples of country and Bluegrass for comparison, allow me to make some suggestions. For a more traditional feel, listen to some Johnny Cash and then compare that with Bill Monroe. Listen to some George Jones and compare that to Flatt and Scruggs. Now, for a more contemporary modern feel, listen to Luke Bryan and compare that with the infamous String Dusters. Country music has a more polished, professional sound, while Bluegrass is definitely more primitive and authentic. Another fun fact, you can't really hear this in the music, but country music is older than Bluegrass, which kind of seems the opposite, doesn't it? Country music was stylized and popularized back in the 1920s, while Bluegrass wasn't really invented until the 1940s. Country music seems more centered around the studio and the stage, while Bluegrass seems more connected to the mountains. Country music is more about broad themes of country life, like love, heartbreak, food, drinking, working, partying, patriotism, while Bluegrass is more about traditional ballads and religion. There's a lot of death and tragedy in bluegrass music. In country music, folks may be down, but they're not out. Country music has a widespread national appeal geared toward radio and streaming, while bluegrass appeals to a niche audience and live performances at festivals. And that gets to the heart of one of the biggest differences between country and bluegrass: musicality. Bluegrass is fast, complex, and features dazzling solos by each instrument on every song. Country music, well, it doesn't. At the risk of offending some people, I'm going to boldly say that bluegrass performers are much better musicians than country musicians. And the reason for that is due to the desired connection of the performance. In order to connect to the audience, like in country music, you don't really have to be very good. You just have to have charisma. But in order to connect to your fellow musicians, like in bluegrass, you better be excellent on your instrument. Now, I love Hank Williams, but he was never known for his guitar skills. That was not his magic. Honestly, can you name a single musician who plays the Hank Williams style of guitar? By contrast, I could probably name 150 banjo pickers who play the Earl Scruggs style. Now, there have certainly been some legendary country performers who were also virtuosos on their instruments, like Chet Atkins, Roy Clark, Jerry Reed, Glenn Campbell, to name a few, but it's not a requirement, and actually they're more of an exception. They're good and talented. It's very commonplace for major country stars to have only a basic functionality on any musical instrument. As long as they've got charisma, they're good to go. Bluegrass performers are much more dedicated to impressing each other than they are the audience. If you've ever been to a bluegrass festival, then you might have noticed that the underlying philosophy of all the performances is, we're going to be playing music up here, and any of you people happen to like it, cool. Another way of saying the exact same thing is that you cannot be a bluegrass performer if you're only average at your instrument. The very nature of bluegrass demands excellence and a very high degree of virtuosity on your instrument. You're not allowed to have an off day in bluegrass because there's nowhere to hide. If you're not at the top of your game, your fellow performers will expose that in a heartbeat. Bluegrass performers constantly push each other to be better and better, and there's no rest from that. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that if a bluegrass performer were not up to his highest standards, then that would be interpreted as insulting to the other musicians. How dare you waste our time like this? Now, I consider myself to be an amateur bluegrass musician, which is a nice way of saying that I'm a bad bluegrass musician. I love bluegrass. I love listening to it, and I love playing it, but I am not a top-notch player by any stretch. There's really not any middle ground in bluegrass. Either you're excellent or you're an amateur. It's highly possible to find some sort of saxophone savant out there who's someone that can play with a beautiful natural tone without any kind of training or instruction, but I guarantee you're not going to find a banjo savant. Anyone who's really good at bluegrass banjo is someone who has devoted their life to it, and they've worked their butt off to get to where they are. And when we come back, we'll compare bluegrass to a totally different style of music that also requires a high degree of virtuosity on the instrument and the ability to play lots of solos. You're listening to The Tom Daniels Show, and we'll be right back.
What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show.
And welcome back to the Tom Daniels Show, and I believe Mary Mac has outdone themselves. Ever since I told them I wanted bluegrass, country, and jazz for this episode, which you're going to hear in a few minutes, and they've all been running around the studio like a bunch of wild kittens. I mean, I love episodes like this one. Mary Mac is the world's most perfect band. And we've been comparing bluegrass to country music and discussing the high degree of musicality required of bluegrass performers. So, let's compare bluegrass to something totally different and see what we get. Now, how about jazz? I've played both styles, and as it turns out, they've got a lot in common. Both are instrumental. Now, there's a lot of famous bluegrass tunes with vocals, that's for sure, but a lot of the repertoire is also instrumental. Both styles also present a round-robin format of solo breaks featuring everybody. Everybody takes a solo on every song, and that's the same for jazz or bluegrass. Both styles require an incredibly high level of virtuosity from the performers. You're not allowed to be okay if you play bluegrass or jazz. You got to be your best at all times. The most popular musicians in either bluegrass or jazz usually have a trademark style of playing that's copied by other players. Now, it doesn't matter if it's a dark, smoky jazz club or a bright, shiny bluegrass festival. Both styles have a jam session quality, which makes it a very self-indulgent art form. The musicians aren't really playing to please the audience. They're playing to please each other. It's incredibly fun to play bluegrass or jazz at that breakneck speed of high virtuosity. And you forget that the audience is even there. It's all you can do to keep up with the other monsters on the stage with you, and it never lets up. I can easily say that bluegrass and jazz are the only two styles that require total concentration at all times. Now, if you're playing rock or country or even classical music, you can let your mind wander and, kind of play on autopilot for a while, and nobody will ever know. But in bluegrass and jazz, you've got to listen intently to everything played by every performer because you're going to be expected to use what you hear when it's your turn. Now, what you choose to play in your solo or even your backup is directly influenced by what the person before you just played. The music is living and breathing on the spot and not prepackaged. You are constantly being tested by your fellow musicians, and it's incredibly exhilarating. There could be 50 people in the audience or 5,000 people in the audience, but it wouldn't make any difference either way to the musicians. They're too busy trying to impress each other than to worry about an audience. Bluegrass and jazz are all about being more spontaneous, while pop music and country music is more slick, polished, and rehearsed. Now, I mentioned that I played amateur bluegrass for a while. In high school, my parents bought me a banjo, and I taught myself to play the Earl Scruggs roll by listening to a ton of Flatt & Scruggs records and copying what I heard. I was okay. Definitely not great. Years and years later, while living in Iowa, I was contacted by the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra because they needed a banjo player for a New Year's Eve performance. They were planning to perform a Stephen Foster medley, and they contacted the only Southerner that they knew, assuming that I knew how to play banjo since I was from Alabama. Well, I can't really fault their logic because they were right. I did know how to play banjo. So that year, I spent my New Year's Eve playing banjo on stage with the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra. It was definitely a unique and surreal moment in my life. Now, the final thing to consider as you listen to bluegrass and jazz concerns the improvised solos. I mean, where do they come from? Sometimes the improvised solos are based on the original melody, and if you listen carefully, you can kind of hear pieces of it buried in the solos. Sometimes these improvised solos are entirely original melodies that the soloist creates right on the spot. And then other times the improvised solos feature signature licks for which the musician is famous and manages to work into many different solos on different songs. But mostly, improvised solos are all of the above. Classical musicians do not improvise. Every note they play is written out for them, and for the most part, they wouldn't even begin to know how to improvise. In the Baroque era, some virtuoso solos were expected to be improvised, and they were at the time. Today, however, those formally improvised Baroque solos are written out and published that way, and they're not improvised anymore. Bluegrass and jazz musicians, on the other hand, are expected to know how to improvise. It's a requirement. So let me try and pull all these threads together. We started with the shared roots and heritage between country and bluegrass music. But then we really unpacked the key differences between them. We talked about the instruments, which are a big immediate difference, electric instruments and drums versus purely acoustic strings. Then there's the overall sound and feel, with country being slicker and more polished, and bluegrass being more raw and primitive. The lyrical themes, the target audiences, and then we dug into the huge difference in virtuosity and skill on the instruments. Country connects primarily to the audience and is easier to play. Bluegrass connects to the other performers and is incredibly difficult to play. And then I made that kind of surprising leap of comparing bluegrass to jazz, highlighting their shared demands: the virtuosity, the constant interaction, and the absolute necessity of improvisation. Now, hopefully you listeners out there have a much clearer sense of what makes these genres distinct, and also how the specific demands of bluegrass successfully connects to a totally unexpected art form that you might never think to link with. Maybe the next time you hear a really riffing banjo or fiddle solo, you'll listen differently. You'll hear that improvisation and follow that conversation happening between the players. So here's a final thought to chew on. Now, drawing from all this, if maybe the most technically demanding music often comes when the musicians are pushing each other and playing for that high internal standard, does that change how you think about the role of the audience in other music you listen to? What really stands out to you now? Thank you, everybody. This has been the Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening. Keep learning.
Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Take a break from your usual routine and tune in to the Tom Daniels Show. You'll discover the world of melodies and stories that you might not know. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show.